New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hello there, I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thought Roots and Branches. This is our 4th episode, and we will be looking at the life of Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. In previous episodes, we looked at the ancient thinking and spiritual traditions that fed into the New Thought tradition, and then we looked at some of the European Enlightenment folks who established what was called Transcendentalism, and then we looked at the life and teachings of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who at the time, in the 1850s and 60s, was considered the philosopher of Transcendentalism, while a man named Phineas Parkhurst Quimby was known as the technician of Transcendentalism. As we go forward, we can see that we have this map in the next slide. You can see this incredibly complex map of folks who have been making this tradition real for us for the last 150 years. And up in that corner up there, the bearded guy, that's our man, Phineas. And he really made a huge difference in the time that he was on the planet. If we look at the next slide, we can see how all of these folks are fitting into the larger picture of those ancient traditions, and then the Europeans, and over there with the lines around him, there's Phineas, and then all of the followers that emerged from the combination of Emerson's teachings and Unitarianism and Phineas's work. The next slide shows us a few pictures of the man. The first one was taken after he had recovered from a long illness, and the second one was taken during the period that he was known as Dr. Quimby, and the last one is kind of a composite that was put together in the very final years of his life. If we go forward, we can look at the slide that has a little bit about Park's early life. He was known as Park. Phineas was a little much for the little boy. And he was born in 1802, which makes him in that first generation of kids who were born after the United States was formed. There were 7 kids in the family. His father was a blacksmith, and he turned out to be a very adept student and also a bit of an engineer, which we'll look at further. Because the father was a blacksmith, 7 kids was a little much to hold on to. And so as soon as Phineas could, he was apprenticed to a clockmaker. In the next slide, you can see that some of his clocks are still around over 200 years later. In the first church there at Belfast, Maine, and then the harp-type clock that is distinctively our man Quimby's design. He was figuring out the most efficient and beautiful way to present the time in that day. There are many people in New England who still have Quimby clocks. Excuse me. Oh, dear. As we go forward, in his late 20s, Quimby began to become quite ill. That's probably why I'm coughing, with the illness that was called consumption at the time. Many doctors tried to feed him various medications, and none of them were working. And then the young man, with an interesting open mind, heard a rumor about another young man who had cured himself by going for a horseback ride, riding at a gallop around the countryside. Well, by the time Quimby found out about this, he was a little bit too weak to do that. But his father, being a blacksmith, had meant that he was really good friends with the guy at the livery stable. So he went over to the livery stable and convinced the guy to let him have a carriage and a horse. And the guy helped him up into the carriage at the livery stable. And he took off at a nice, comfortable pace up into the countryside, breathing the fresh air. Because one of the things we have to remember, and you'll hear about this from me often, is that during that period of time, there were animals everywhere. There was pollens and dust everywhere. There was smoke from open fireplaces and wood stoves, and there were smoke from factory chimneys, and there were no vacuum cleaners and no paved roads. So you can imagine the kind of dust and dirt that was in the air that people were breathing and having difficulties with. So consumption weakened Quimby to the point where the business he had built up, making those beautiful clocks, he had to sell in order to support his wife and children. And, well, even then, he was facing bankruptcy. So this ride was like the last-ditch effort. How was he going to make it? Going out into the countryside on the horse, he began to feel a little bit better. But one of the things about New England at that time, without paved roads, it meant that if there had been a rain of any kind, the roads were very muddy and slick, and there were a lot of what we would call potholes in the cement today, but they were real holes in the mud then. The horse got bogged down in the mud on the road, and Quimby couldn't even get out of the carriage to go help his horse out. He was sitting there totally without recourse until some farmer not too far away figured out while he was plowing that the guy was stuck. So came over and worked with the horse, pulled him out a little bit, and gave that horse a big whack on the rear end. Now, we know this from some of the autobiographical writings that have come from Quimby's manuscripts. This isn't just pious legend. So he gives the horse this big whack on the rear end, and of course it takes off. And Quimby is so weak, he can't control the horse at all. So the horse just goes around the loop back to the livery stable. It runs maybe half an hour at most to get there. And Quimby's hanging on for dear life, just barely able to survive this ride. But when he gets to the livery stable, oh my goodness, his strength is back and he can breathe. The guy helps him down from the carriage and he virtually bounces down and he heads over to his own home, just kind of amazed. And he realizes there is something going on here that the doctors have not been addressing. There's something about what happened. Now, if those symptoms had only gone away temporarily, we would say, the adrenaline, it's like a cortisone shot, right? The adrenaline overrode the symptoms, but they never returned. He never had the symptoms of consumption again. He did have later symptoms that were reactions to the medication that he had been given, but that's another story. So at this point, we've got a very healthy Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, Park, who no longer has a clockmaking business, but he has an engineering turn of mind. So if you look at the next slide, he starts inventing things. And this is one of his several patents for a saw table, if you can believe it, a saw table in the 1830s. And then he had other patents and he experimented with various things. And if you look at the next picture, the next slide, you'll see two photographs. One of them is a photograph he took. He became a photographer because that was something he could do easily and didn't take a lot of investment. And that's his children right there in the oval. But the other one is one of his next inventions. This is Quimby himself, but notice that he's standing in front of a very interesting screen. The way photographs were taken there, they were actually what are called daguerreotypes, when daguerreau comes from the French. And what it was the screen, the lens on the camera would be open, and everyone would have to sit absolutely still for as much as 20 minutes while the light penetrated through the lens to the silver plate at the back. So Quimby's invention was this screen that reflected the light from around and shortened the time that it took to take the photo, which made him very popular as a photographer and allowed him to support his family. So that was another patent that he made for photograph or daguerreotype images, that screen. If we go on to the next slide, we can see that he was still wondering what happened to him, that he wasn't sick anymore. And one of Mesmer's students came to New England and was touring and teaching people and demonstrating mesmerism, which in our day we would call hypnosis. And he said, wow, this seems related. So Park studied with this guy, learned how, and set up another business, a winter business, because in the summer he was doing photographs. In the winter, he would go around New England demonstrating mesmerism. And very quickly, he latched onto a young man, 19-year-old Lucius Berkmar. And he and Lucius would travel together for 6 to 8 weeks in the wintertime when the sleighs actually could travel more easily across the snow and ice than a muddy road would allow a horse and cart during the rest of the year. So it turned out to be quite a good balance for him. And they did this for several years. We have the journals from a couple of those trips from Lucius, as well as Quimby's own letters and manuscripts. But as they were going around, what would happen is Park would put Lucius in a trance, and then he would ask questions, and then people from the audience would begin to ask questions. And after a few weeks, months, certainly in the second tour, Lucius started doing things like telling people, oh, your husband will be home in about 3 weeks. The ship is at such and such a point. You know, these are New Englanders. Almost everybody was on ships. Or he would say, that watch you're looking for, that necklace you're looking for is in the third drawer in the attic, or words to that effect. And Park's quite impressed by this. This is not just going into a trance and, whatever. This is telepathy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, all kinds of things that they didn't have language for then. And then people would start saying something, and Lucius would say, that illness you're dealing with, you can fix it with, and then he would describe something very much like Casey's remedies, actually, Edgar Casey, about 80 years later. And that would be, peppermint tea or blackstrap molasses mixed with some other stuff or whatever. If you will take this 3 times a day for 5 days, you won't have this issue anymore. And this was fascinating to Quimby, to think that an apparently, innocuous sort of thing might help someone get well. And he began to see a relationship here between his own experience and what Lucius was doing. And then he noticed that if he had a thought about something, often Lucius would start acting as if he had heard Quimby's thought. That really had him interested. So he began to do experiments. And the one that is most famous is they were on the stage and Lucius was answering questions from the audience. And Quimby imagined a lion roaring onto the stage directly at Lucius. Well, you can imagine if Quimby's thoughts were being felt, that what Lucius might do, and he did. He got up, he jumped up and got out of there as fast as he could, thinking that that lion was real. Oh my. That was one of several experiments that Quimby did with Lucius and with other people using this mesmerism process. Then he began to experiment in other ways around this whole illness thing, right? Well, finally, after one tour, they're all done. They're packing up. The sleigh's been returned. Everything's ready. Lucius is getting ready to head out the door. And then he turns back and he looks at Quimby and he says, you know that problem that you've been having with your kidneys, which Quimby had never mentioned. He said, I can fix that if you'll let me put my hands on your back. One of your kidneys is hanging on by a thread, and the other one is only half functioning. Well, Quimby let Lucius do that, and almost immediately the symptoms went away. If we look at the next slide, you can see the two of them together, Lucius and Quimby, in one of those hypnosis demonstrations. And this was how they would be together when they were demonstrating the mesmerism. And you can see, almost imagine what would happen if they turned around and Lucius was standing behind Quimby, put his hands on his back and said, there, now they are fixed. And Quimby never had those symptoms again. The kidney issues were a result of the medication he had received for the consumption, mostly the mercury, but other things that he'd been given. That ended Quimby's interest in mesmerism. He knew this was not what was happening here. So Lucius and he never traveled together. And he spent a year, Quimby did, spent a year studying, experimenting, reading, trying to understand what was really happening here. And if you look at the next slide, in 1854, Quimby set up an office saying, I know what is causing belief or illness, and it is your belief. Okay, if you read the text there, I'll read it to you. My theory, he said, the trouble is in the mind. For the body is only the house for the mind to dwell in. If your mind has been deceived by some invisible enemy into a belief, you have put it into the form of a disease, with or without your knowledge. By my theory or truth, I come in contact with your enemy and restore you to health and happiness. If your mind has been deceived into a belief, you have been put into the form of a disease. This was the theory he was working with. Over the next 12 years, he had 12,000 patients or clients. He began to be known as Dr. Quimby because people were coming away healed. He didn't touch them, although occasionally he said he would touch someone's hands just to reassure them. It wasn't about touch. It was about knowing the truth. Typically, 3 to 6 sessions would turn around the person's experience. And then there were others that, people would send letters saying, Dr. Quimby, I have this problem, or someone would say their mother had this problem or their daughter had this problem. So he would respond to that person and he would say words to this effect, that you've been handed a belief and we're going to change this belief. And what is true about you is, and then he would do things like quote from the Bible, all the quotations that were about who we truly are, what Jesus said about who people are, what Elisha and Elias did in the Old Testament, and so on. So he was able to give people some kind of intellectual support for what it was that he was telling them. And in those days, almost everyone had read the Bible. A few people had also read Shakespeare, as he had, but it was the Bible that everyone had in common. So he used the King James Version of the New Testament mostly, and some Old Testament, to help people see what was truly the case. He began to be very angry with ministers and with doctors for 2 reasons. Mostly, he now understood what a subjective state of mind was, because as a trained hypnotherapist, which is what he had become for a while, but certainly as a trained hypnotist, he knew that if some people are in a situation where they believe someone is in authority and they are receptive, they will accept what that person says as truth, regardless of what their intellect or previous experience has told them. And he said, in the case of his own diagnoses, he had been in that kind of state when he went into the doctor's office and the doctor told him he had these diseases, right? Whether it was consumption or kidney disease or whatever, and had said, the only thing that will cure you is whatever. And sometimes it worked, but most often, at least for Quimby, it did not work. So he was very upset with doctors for telling people they had an illness and then telling them that there was only one way to fix it. He would start writing letters to various newspapers being, upset about what was happening when people would come to him. The other people that he was very upset with were ministers. And the reason for that is more about the culture of the time than about what the Bible teaches or what ministers are trying to do. The culture at the time focused on a version or interpretation of a few passages in the New Testament in which people began to believe that if they didn't do what Jesus said was holy, or the 10 Commandments, or any number of other things that were good behaviors that God would approve of, they would be sent to hell. They were bad people. And so a huge part of his job was undoing that. And these sermons that the preachers, the ministers of the time were delivering would be 1 to 2 hours of exhortations and proofs from the Bible that this was true. So you can imagine week after week after week, you've been singing songs, you've been lulled into the community, and then you hear these words and you've absorbed them. Quimby was furious that this was happening to people because he could see the damage that was being done. He could see what the belief was that was causing the problem. So he would sit with someone, anybody who came into his office. He would sit quietly. He would say, "You don't have to tell me anything. I don't need to know anything." He would sit very quietly and he would tune in. And he was known as having a very intense focus. So he would tune in. He might look at someone's body. He might look into their eyes. He might close his eyes. And when he felt that he had the solution to the issue, he would tell them, these are the issues you're dealing with. These are your symptoms. And these are the causes of your symptoms. And now I'm going to tell you the truth. And he would quote the Bible again. He would tell them the true nature of their being. That is, they are a child of God, and they are co-inheritors with the Christ, which is a straight out of Paul. Child of God is everywhere throughout the New Testament. And as children of God, they were co-inheritors with Christ for all that the Christ had to offer. And the Christ told us that the kingdom of heaven is within us, and therefore we cannot be separated. So he would go on in this vein. Some people would leave after one session and never have the symptoms again. Most people would take 3 or 4 sessions. A few people would take as many as 6 sessions before the old belief that they had come in with was no longer the dominant belief generating the symptoms. And the new ideas that Quimby had been persuading them of were replacing the old ideas. You can see how this is the beginning of new thought. Yes, we replace the old thoughts with a new thought, and the old conditions pass away. So in the letters that he wrote, he would say, now pay attention. This is what's true about you. And then he would say, I want you to imagine that I'm sitting there with you. Read this letter 5 times every hour or every day, depending on the condition. Read this letter over and over again. He'd give them a precise prescription what to do. And he would tell them if there were Bible passages for them to read, he'd tell them to do that. And almost invariably, he would be getting a letter within days or weeks saying the condition has been reversed. So you can imagine about 1999 when I am doing some research on Phineas Parker's Quimby, and there's hardly anything on the internet. There's just one set of books at that time called the Quimby manuscripts. You can imagine my amazement when I learned that 12,000 people had been relieved of all of their symptoms by this man that we have never heard of in most of American history. If we go on to the next slide, we can see that when he opened his offices, they were in Belfast, Maine, in that building. And I had the delight one year, not too long ago, of being able to go to that building and see where his offices were. So this is all real. This isn't a mythological tale to help us try to believe in these things. This is the office that Quimby was occupying. He was there day after day for 12 years. And his family was feeling a little abandoned because he would leave early in the morning and he would come home late at night. And he would sometimes then go to his desk at home and write those letters until he couldn't stay awake anymore. He would be collapsed at his desk, or he would stumble into bed. His kids and his wife were carrying the household while he did this. The upside was there was plenty of money for the household to survive on. The downside was there was no dad in the household, no father to be helpful. He was totally focused on making this process, which he called the science of Christ, making this available to whoever was interested. Well, along about 1864, after he'd been doing this for about 10 years, one of the people who wandered into his office was a woman who had had severe pain off and on all of her life, so much so she had never gone to school, she had been home taught, and she had married young, and she had been widowed very shortly after her first marriage, and had returned to New England, was living with her brother, which was normal at that time. If you were unmarried, you'd have to live with some man somewhere because you were not entitled as a woman to any property or any income or any career. So she returned as a widow, and it happened that she returned just immediately prior to the Seneca Falls conferences, the women's conferences that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had launched. And in those conferences, what became clear was that there were ways for women to earn money that were not strenuous physical labor and did not require lots and lots of schooling. And so the young Mrs. Glover, Mary Baker Glover, attended a homeopathic institute and became a homeopathic physician, which is to say she learned how to do those dissolving things. You take a test tube and you add liquid to whatever your chemical is. And the chemical is something that would normally cause the symptoms you're trying to relieve. So you take that and then you shake it up a certain number of times. And then you pour it into 10 test tubes and you fill all of those with water and you shake them up. And then you pour them into 10 more. You do this at least 6 times and sometimes more than that. So that by the time the homeopathic remedy is prepared, there may not even be a whole molecule of the original substance in the water. But as some scientists discovered, there somehow is some memory of what that substance did in this fluid. And she learned to either inject the fluid or convert it, dehydrate it into tablets. And if you go to a shelf, a homeopathic shelf, this is exactly what you will find today. And she learned which combination of things to give to whom. And while she was doing her internship, she had a patient come in. And I'll tell you more about that in the next episode. But she did see during that time, Mrs. Glover learned that it was possible for someone to have their experience, their symptoms reversed without actually having medication. This was significant for her. And so very soon after she graduated from the Homeopathic Institute, she married a dentist, an itinerant dentist named Dr. Patterson. And Dr. Patterson and Mrs. Glover would travel around New England, and they would visit various places, and they would deliver lectures, and they would offer treatments. Well, she came to Belfast, she and her husband, and she heard about Dr. Quimby, and she went to visit him, and lo and behold, her symptoms were reduced. And by the 3rd session, they were gone. She said, oh my goodness, I have to learn this. So she sat with him for 6 more sessions until she felt she really understood the procedure. And then she went around the country, and we have newspaper articles demonstrating and talking about this. Again, I'll give you more details next time. But Mrs. Patterson, after a while, became part of the community that supported Dr. Quimby and Dr. Quimby's methods. That was Dr. Quimby's mental healing methods. Another group of people who studied with him were a family of the Dressers, the Julius Dresser family, who also were homeopaths. And they saw that belief had as much to do with the symptoms as anything else. And another man who studied with him was a man named Warren Felt Evans. Now, Evans was already an Emersonian and Swedenborgian transcendentalist. So he was just saying, oh, good, here's the technology to support what I understand. And Evans was a minister, and he set up a sanatorium as a healing ministry with his wife and wrote a number of books. And Evans' books were the first ones that were published that had Quimby's methods. So we have thousands of people, including some people who became pretty important, studying with Quimby and learning his methods. Unfortunately, Quimby's work habits destroyed his own immune system, so that in the fall of 1866, as we will see in the next slide, he had passed on. His manuscripts in that period shortly after his death were transferred over to the Dresser family, Julius and his wife and his son. And they had every intention of publishing those manuscripts, but somehow never got around to it, and neither did their son. So it was not for another almost 60 years before the rest of the world began to have access to Quimby's own words about what he had been teaching. And so in the 1920s, a book was published called The Quimby Manuscripts. Now, it turns out that was a very, very, very small part of what is actually out there. And a few years ago, someone actually published the bulk of them in 2 volumes of very fine print. So you can get online and you can go to the books and see what Quimby himself had to say about both his method and what was going on in the culture around it. Well, as I say, one reporter who said, Emerson is the philosopher, but Quimby is the technologist or the technician. When Quimby was working, people immediately felt the difference. Some of them were feeling as if somehow his will was what was making the difference. But what he knew was it was his determined focus and knowledge of the truth of their being that actually made the change. And that's why he wrote about the truth. And that was why he was so angry at physicians and ministers who continually told people what he considered to be lies about what their true nature was and about how the world worked and about how their bodies worked. That anger, I think, as much as anything else, contributed to his passing, because how can you renew your immune system if you're in angry state most of the time? As Joe Dispenza has been showing us lately, a few minutes of gratitude can greatly boost the immune system, whereas anger greatly reduces it. More and more modern studies have been reinforcing what it was that Phineas Parkhurst Quimby discovered in his own 30s and 40s. So what I'd like you to consider the possibility of is if there were a person in your world today who was able to do and be what Phineas was able to, what Park was able to do and be, do you think you would go visit them? What do you think would happen to your own issues around your body, or to the bodies of those that you were focusing on when you were writing to him or visiting to him? This world could really use more people who are willing to understand and apply Quimby's methods. And those methods, again, be fully present to the person till you have a sense of what's really going on for them. Going on for them in their body. If they have to tell you things, listen to them deeply. Going on for them in their feeling state. What are they actually feeling going on for them, and the beliefs and thoughts behind those feelings? And once you've got a sense of that, know which beliefs are, as one of the later New Thought teachers that we'll talk about used to say, strikes the chord of their being. To some extent, this is what Louise Hay has done. She has said, if you have such and such set of symptoms, they're associated with such and such set of beliefs and feelings about yourself. And if you will say these things and restate your belief in these ways, you can begin to undo those symptoms. Wow. 12,000 people freed of their symptoms simply because a man who was dying of consumption realized it's not about the chemicals we're taking in. It's not about the physical history we have. It's not about anything outside of who and what we think we are in any given moment. And since then, millions of people have benefited from this teaching in all kinds of ways. And we're going to be looking at all kinds of the ways that people have been teaching this, because everyone has their own version of it. If you ever get a chance to go to Belfast, you might take a chance and go by and look at his gravestone, go by and look at the office building he worked in, because some of that energy is still there. That energy of knowing the truth, in the same way as Quimby thought that the Christ knows the truth, because the Christ, as Quimby believed it, was not just in the person we call Jesus, but is present in all beings, just needs to be recognized and brought forth. And that Christ is a healing presence, which is why he honestly believed and taught that he had found the science of Christ and applied it over and over again. Now, Quimby's children have grown up, needless to say, several of them did. And one of his sons, George, did write an autobiography, and you can get hold of that too. And I've written a little biography of him that is called The Power of Mind. It's designed for young children. And in my book, Healing by Words Alone, which is my history of the New Thought movement. And we will be touching in on that book as we go forward, because, well, it's my version of the history of the New Thought movement, right? And as we look at these people, we'll see how each one of them influenced all the others. And we will also see that the people that they are influencing are so much broader than the ones we know about. You know, the Quimby people ended up being about 50 other folks who went on and taught what it was that they learned from him. But not all of them were published, and not all of them established institutions, and not all of them were known by later generations to be using the Quimby method of mental healing, right? So think about what that might be, or what might show up as in your world if that were available to you, or available to the people you care about. You might even do what Park used to do, and that is experiment. Think about someone who has symptoms right now, and think about the beliefs and feelings they have about who they are and how the world works, and consider what would happen if you wrote, or you stated, or you thought without any reservations at all, a different idea. An idea based on the living Christ in everyone. An idea based on the kingdom of heaven in everyone. An idea based on the reality that, in fact, in reality, we are all expressions of what we've called God. And we are all becoming more fully every day the healthy, well, whole experience of that expression. Yes? Yes. Now, I've given you this life, I've given you these principles, and I'm wondering if you can possibly relate to this young man, I'm going to flip back to an early slide, and I hate to do that to my fellow here, but we're going to go back to the fourth slide where we have 3 pictures of Quimby. One of them is with the daguerreotype behind him. One of them is he's standing with a hat. You got it. Thank you, sir. And that picture is when he's in the peak of health, almost 30 years after he was dying. He is the embodiment of the healthy, strong, powerful person of that period. The one next to it is taken about the same time without the full figure. I'm guessing that those are photographs taken with his equipment, because why else would he do it? Or who else would he let do it? And except maybe his kids. And I'm guessing that those pictures are to help us understand that at no time are we stuck with what the doctors have told us about who we are. No time are we stuck with the prognosis that we have been given about what the body must do. And the fact that he passed on not too many years after these photos tells us we also need to take care of ourselves and live a balanced life, not overly balanced, not out of balance. He ended up spending all of his waking hours serving other people. And, well, that's not how it works. We all need to be able to care for ourselves and our families as well as the people out there in the world. So these photographs are a marvelous reminder of the potential of using these methods of training the mind, if you will, training the brain to understand that who and what we are is not what the doctor or the minister or the parent or any other person outside of us ever said about us. Who and what we are and how the world works and how the body works is much more a function of what we know to be true, what we have faith in, what our belief system deep down inside, not on the surface. Oh, I believe in this. If I can say that, I probably don't. Not our surface belief system, but what we know to be true. And we'll talk more about that as we talk more about some of the follow-ons to Quimby's work. With that, I'm going to wish you well, and we will continue this series. Our next show is going to focus on the founder of a movement that is now called Christian Science, the former student of Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, Mary Baker Glover Patterson Eddy. And it's a fascinating life to look at. So bless you, my dears. I look forward to seeing you next time. And I'm really curious, if you really feel like you'd like to let me know, contact me at ruthlmillerphd.com and tell me what happens as you play and work and experiment with Quimby's mental healing method. Thank you very much.